and we are on chapter 7. So, or is it chapter 6? Nope, chapter 7, which is all about drawing inferences. So this is the overview for this week. We're going to just be focusing on chapter 7. You will take a quiz on chapter 6. Now that was, I believe, patterns of organization. That was the last one that we did in Unit 5. Let's go back there so you can see. It looks like, sorry, the quiz is on chapter 7. You already took the quiz on chapter 6, um, which is down here. So it's the quiz for this unit. It's your 6th quiz because we combined chapters 1 and 2, and you just had one quiz, and that always throws me off. So it is a quiz on chapter 7 this week. So we're going to talk about chapter 7 today, and we're going to do some work with it both tonight and on Thursday night. And then you should take your quiz at, sometime after that so that it's preferably like Thursday, so it's fresh in your mind. So there's not a lot of materials in this week because we're only doing the one chapter. So here's where you'll find the slides, and then here's where you'll find the lecture notes. And recently, we were told that we needed to make everything accessible, and I've done that for your class. Everything should be accessible at this point. If I miss anything, you can let me know, but it should be everything, this as well as this. So let's get started. I'll use this slideshow. And this is all about inferences. I don't know if anyone here knows what an inference is. Does anybody know already? So we'll learn about it today if you don't. But these are our learning objectives here. We want to be able to define what an inference is and then be able to make inferences while reading. When you talk about inferences, it's hard to learn how to do that without talking about the difference between connotative and denotative language. So we'll talk about that. And also, what falls into these categories are euphemisms. And politically correct language is a form of euphemism. So we're going to talk about that as well. Then we're going to get to figurative language. So we have literal language, which is language that is meant to be taken literally, meaning if you look up the word in a dictionary, it's exactly what the meaning is. Whereas figurative language, you can't look it up in a dictionary. Modern dictionaries probably do have information on figurative language, but a traditional dictionary would not provide that information. So it's kind of figures of speech. It's not meant to be taken literally. A quick example would be if I say I'm going to go jump in the shower, I don't mean I'm going to stand in the shower and jump up and down, right? We all know, which means I'm going to hurry up and take a shower. I'm going to take a really fast shower when we say something like that. So you can't look up jump and understand what I meant when I say that. So that's what we mean when we talk about figurative language. It's not meant to be taken literally. We're also going to talk about using what the text says and schemata, which is that prior knowledge, um, in order to make or draw inferences. Let me just quick mark that Janisa is here. Sorry. And then we'll go right back to that. So, making logical conclusions while reading as well. So using logic when not everything that you need to know is precisely in the text. You have to kind of draw some conclusions. So there's 3 levels of reading. So in order to understand the inferential level, it's good to learn about what the other 2 levels are. So the first one is the literal level, and that's where when we talk about reading comprehension, can you understand the words that you're reading? What is the message that the author is trying to say at the literal level? exactly what's in the textbook. So if you were asked a literal level question, you could find it. You could touch it with your finger if you had a physical book, or even if you were on a screen. You could say, there's the answer right there. The words are literally right there. When we talk about the evaluative level, and I guess I should move through these slides rather than just talk about it all at once, but just real fast, we're talking about going beyond what the text says. So here, for literal, we say read on the lines. For inferential, we say read between the lines. And for evaluative, we say read beyond the lines. So it's not in the textbook. You have to take the knowledge you gained and what you know about the world, and then you move beyond that and you evaluate maybe what the author is saying. You maybe make an opinion about it, whether you agree or disagree with it. You might also be using that information and applying it to something else, making a connection to what this says to something else, that sort of thing. So let's talk about what these one at a time. Let me just, I think I already marked that Rebecca's here. She must have just lost connection. So literal level, the most basic level of reading, um, on the lines, as we said before, and it's just understanding what the text means. What is the author saying, directly stating in this? So you'll have questions where you have to find facts in an article or a textbook chapter or something, and they're there for you to find. It's very easy to find them. So answers to literal questions, right in the text. Evaluative level, so that's where you go beyond. So you're kind of making a judgment, or you are making connections to something else out there, something in your memory, something in the world, going beyond what the text says and thinking about it more broadly, right? And connecting it to other things. So, when we talk about what is the theme, what is the thesis, sometimes it's directly stated in the text, and that would be at the literal level because you could find it. But also, sometimes it's hard to know. Maybe the thesis is only implied and they didn't directly state it. And then you have to be able to understand everything you've read and make that connection to here's overall what the reader is trying or what the writer wants us to know. And then you could even go beyond that and say, well, I think that this same person would feel this way about this other issue or something else. So you're applying it and you're going beyond just what the textbook says. And when we talk about making connections, so we have text to text, text to self, and text to world. So text to text is when you say, oh yeah, I read another text that talked about that, but the author had a different viewpoint than this one, or they share the same viewpoint, or maybe it's a different type of text. Maybe, oh, I read a novel and this was an issue in the novel that was addressed because one of the characters was going through whatever they were going through, and this was kind of one of the motifs in the book or something. Or text to self, and that's where your own experiences in life, your own memories, people you know that you're in touch with personally. That's making a connection with what you're reading to yourself. And then there's text to world. So, what do you know about the world, history, present, anything going on at all outside of your personal group that you are, your town. Even your town could be counted as text to world because it's not yourself. But generally, like your inner group of people would kind of be still a self situation. So you're going beyond that. So it could be something going on, you know, outside of your own group of people in just that small area or in somewhere far away across the globe. So anything going on in the world would be a text to world type of connection. And then we have inferential level, and that's the one we're dealing with in this particular chapter. So it's where the text is not giving you the complete information. So you have to take what the text literally says and stay true to what it literally says, but you have to fill in the gaps by thinking about what you know already about whatever is being discussed, or what you know about human nature, what you know about the world, um, anything that relates to what the text is in, physical properties of things. It just depends what they're talking about in the text. So any kind of background knowledge you have that relates to it, and any kind of experience you have where you've seen things in life and you've seen how people respond to certain situations, that relate, like when you're talking about what's in the text and you have to make an educated guess. So it involves evidence in the text that you could point your finger at and see it literally written there. And then what is not talked about, you have to use your prior knowledge and you combine them and you make an educated guess. So when we talk about literal versus inferential, I've already kind of said all of this, but literal, it's right there. You can find the answer in the text. You don't have to really use a whole lot of brain power to figure it out. But when you get to the inferential level, you have to interpret the text. So all the information's not there. So you have to think a little more. Think about, what um, might happen if it's, depending on what it is, based on what you know about the world and life and humans and the issue, or physical structures that they're discussing. So that you cannot find the inferential question answer directly in the text, but you cannot ignore the text either. It has to be true to the text. It has to align with what the text tells you. So you can't go completely against what the text says. Whatever you conclude, it can't be against what the text says. It can be, the text is the basis for your answer, and then you have to go beyond. I just have to see real fast. Um, Whoever just came in, can you tell me your name? I'm just asking because there was no name on it just said iPhone and a phone number. And I want to be able to mark you present. So if you
Promise. I put it in the
it's
chat.
promise. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. I don't even know where the chat is.
No, it's okay.
I'm not really that good at this, especially when I'm sharing the screen. I can't really see it. Okay, let's go back. So we talked about this already, so I'm going to move on. So making a reasonable inference. One good way to think about it is it's a conversation between the writer and the reader. So the writer tells you things in the conversation, and then you think about what that writer said, and then you add to it what you know. So if you think of it like that, that's how you draw an inference. So you have to look for clues that are present in the text and then what you know about the world and put them together. So, and the clues that you would look for is just facts that are presented, and it depends on what question you're trying to answer or what you're trying to achieve through drawing the inference. But whatever they directly state, but it goes kind of beyond that too, because almost every text has bias. And what that means is if even when I'm trying to be as objective as possible, some of my personal views are going to sneak in there without me even realizing it. But a lot of the times writers do put their views in, they don't even try to be completely 100% objective. It really does depend on what kind of text it is, but almost all these days, especially, there is bias. So you have to try to determine that in order to be able to draw that inference. So what type of words do they use? And why do they choose that particular word when they could have chosen a different word that means something similar, but the feeling you get from the word is different. And we call those connotations, by the way. So the denotation is the dictionary definition. If you looked up the word, whatever the dictionary says is the meaning, that is the denotation. And when you go beyond that and you think about, well, how does that word make me feel? It becomes different. Like if I said, the store was mobbed, um, that is a different feeling than if I said, um, I'm going to a gathering at the bookstore, right? Both things mean, we got gathering and we've got mob. They both mean a lot of people in one spot, right? But one has a negative connotation. It sounds almost violent, right? A mob. We think an angry mob, even, right? And the other word sounds pleasant. It's a gathering, right? It's friendly. Everybody's there to enjoy themselves, kind of thing. So you have to look at what words the author chooses to use and decide, are they negative? Are they positive? What is the tone that comes out of that, which is the author's attitude toward the subject? You can use those word choices and the connotations to decide what the author's tone is. And that will help you draw inferences. So interpret the clues, including those connotations, and use logic, reasoning, what you know about the world, about people operating in it, and make that educated guess. Let me just mark Mohammed here. Fast. I don't even know where it is. I'm just going to write the name down. All right, we'll come back to it. So let's move on. Inferential equation, I feel like I'm being redundant and I apologize for that, but it's the same thing. What the author says, reader schemata, what you know, and you use that to draw an inference. So this is just an equation format for it, if that helps you understand it a little bit better. So when we talk about humor, that's one place where you really have to draw inferences because they don't tell you the meaning of the joke, right? It's usually implied, which means it's not directly stated. It's not explicit. It's implied where you have to kind of draw it out and figure out what it is. So it's not stated directly, but it's hinted at. And so you have to figure it out. And if you don't have enough background knowledge to get the joke, it's impossible to get the joke. So if it's a character of somebody and you have no idea who that person is, you're not going to be able to understand what they're making fun of the person for, right? Because most of those political cartoons and other kinds of cartoons are definitely generated to criticize someone or something that's going on. And they do it in a comical way. So with caricatures, they over exaggerate the physical aspects of a person. Like if their nose is slightly larger than average, they'll make it look huge and that sort of thing. So any feature they have, they'll accentuate to a grotesque um, point. So that will make it look funnier to some people. So, but it's not all about cartoons. It can be humor in anything. In an essay, someone could use humor, or in a advertisement for something, which we see a lot. When I was a kid, there was less humor, I feel like, in ads, and I think it became more popular over the years to use humor because I think people realize they can get people's attention better by using humor than by dictating to them some facts or something. So we all like humor. There's also like satirical skits and things. If you think of, I don't know if anybody's ever watched Saturday Night Live, but that would be an example of humor in the form of skits. So they don't tell you what you're supposed to get from it or the point they're trying to make. They are just, you have to figure it out. And that's called drawing an inference. So you look at what are they exaggerating? What is their word choice? And then you try to figure out, make an educated guess about what they're saying about whatever that topic is. So connotative language is very important in drawing inferences because writers can choose various words to mean what they're trying to say. So, like I use the example of mob and crowd, or sorry, mob and gathering, right? They're very, very different senses to them. Another would be saying skinny versus slender, right? Skinny sounds like a criticism, like you're too skinny, right? But slender sounds positive, like, oh, you look nice, right? You're slender. And these are, and maybe this is different today because I am not able to keep up with the sense of how words change because they definitely change. And I've seen them like certain words change multiple times over the course of my 60 years of life. And they do change, and I might not be on top of what they currently are. But that's one example that came to my mind about that. So there are lots of other ones too, just tons of them. But you ask yourself, well, why did they use this particular word? That seems like a unique word to use in this situation. Like, what's the generic word that everybody else would use all the time? They didn't choose that word, they chose something else. So that's your first step is to notice that. Notice that they use this word that most people wouldn't use. And then ask yourself, why did they use that word? What is the feeling that I get from it? How do I respond to it? How am I affected by it? And then that's probably what the effect they wanted to create. So then that's why they used it. And then what does that mean for what they're talking about? Is it negative or positive kind of thing? So euphemisms are ways to kind of make something that might be offensive less offensive, or something that might be harsh less harsh, or something that might be impolite more polite, right? So there's Chris. So an example would be I'm going to the powder room instead of I'm going to the toilet, right? It's the powder room is more polite. The toilet invokes imagery, right? We see that porcelain thing and we know what people do on it. So it's considered less polite than saying powder room. What the imagery is a big powder puff, right? So we don't really see exactly what goes on in there in our mind's eye. So this would be, and another example here is for death. Instead of saying, talk using the word death or die, you people say past or at rest or moved on or gone to a better place, right? All of those are positive, right? Whereas this is negative. So euphemisms take something negative and they try to turn it into something less negative. And sometimes it even sounds positive. So, an example in the politically correct language that the military uses, plenty of euphemisms, right? Friendly fire. That sounds like something good, right? It's friendly. But what it actually is somebody getting shot at by one of their own troop members or military. So it's usually done by accident, except in Vietnam, but we won't get into that. Anyway, the term friendly fire doesn't seem offensive at all. It seems like happy almost, right? And there have been um, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there have been military missions where they're bombing people and killing people beneath those bombs, right? And they call it something that sounds really positive when it's actually a lot of people dying in a very violent way. So this is an example of military using euphemism, politically correct language. But there's lots of politically correct language, especially today, I think. And like I said, in my 60 years, I've seen certain words that were appropriate become now they mean something else, and now that's not appropriate. And then a new word is used, and then that word becomes negative, and then they change it to another word, and so on and so forth. Language is constantly evolving and changing depending on how people use it. And so um, you'll see a lot of terms changing, like, okay, this is not what we say anymore. Now we say this. And I've seen it in education a lot. Um, uh, Even times when I don't really understand because I never learned it the right way the first time. And then we learn a new term that we have to use. For one example is with English language learners. There have been at least three or four different acronyms for that. And it just keeps changing because they're constantly trying to make it sound less offensive in some way. To me, it was never offensive to begin with, but um, it's just that type of thing, like trying to make it more pleasant, whatever it is. If there's a stigma attached to something, they want to not make it that way. Another example of that is gifted education became special interest. And I've been in department meetings where they want to change language for like the leveling of groups, like the honors group versus the lowest level of English or something, not as a language, but as a an art, that's a course that you take in school. And they would come up with different names so that no one would know who was in the honors and who was in the other, so that they're not offending anyone, right? To make it be not offensive to anyone. And so it's all um, that's politically correct language. That's what that is trying to do. Changing gifted to special interest is for political reasons, to make it unoffensive to somebody else. Sometimes it's the gifted person who's offended by that because that puts a lot of pressure on them. And sometimes it's the other people that feel, well, I'm not in a gifted group. So they want to, make it less offensive for that group. So you see that a lot, and you see it with terms like with body image, like we talked about skinny and slender. There's constantly new words coming up, and that's what we mean by politically correct. I'm sure you guys know this better than I do because I was born in a different generation. For you, it's second nature to think about these things. So, but language is important. Words have connotations, they make us feel things. Here's another example. There was a time when people didn't want to be called housewife because they felt that it was demeaning, that people didn't respect housewives, even though they maintained an entire family, which is like a business. And they took care of children and educated them and did all of these other things. So they wanted to be called domestic engineers. So that started to be a term that is used. In fact, I ordered a sandwich from Subway today, and it said there was a sign that said something about your sandwich artist. Ask your sandwich artist for something. So a sandwich artist sounds much better than a fast food worker, right? A restaurant worker. So these are just all examples of language and how it can be used to to have a different connotation, a different feeling about it, to be more pleasant to somebody or a group of people. So figurative language then is the opposite of literal language. So when we talk about reading at the literal level, that means we understand what the words mean on a dictionary level. But they also kind of at that stage, you should understand some figurative language as well in order to be able to understand a text fully. But figurative language is not literal. It's not something you can look up in the dictionary. And I gave you that example already of jumping in the shower. Another one is it's raining cats and dogs, right? And that, I don't know, maybe that's an old-fashioned expression, but that's something that we used to say when I was younger. And it meant that it's pouring rain. Like there's a lot of rain being dumped all at once. And that was just an expression. But if you didn't know English and you didn't know figurative language, that particular expression, even like probably younger people that are in this class might have never heard of that. They'd be like, what are they talking about? It's not literally cats and dogs coming down from the sky. And it, but why do we use non-literal language? Because it's fun. It's more entertaining. It's better to say than it's raining very hard. That's boring, right? So we use figurative language a lot because it's fun. Like if you learn an expression that you hear somebody else say and you really like it, you start using it too, right? Because it's kind of fun. And it also creates a bond with other people that also understand that figurative language, right? That it's like a code almost, and it kind of can create um, like a special close-knit group that other people wouldn't understand what they're saying. But a lot of the figurative language is universal. You know, people who speak that language will encounter it. It starts somewhere. Somebody starts it, and then enough people learn it that it becomes just common knowledge that that's what that means. So here's an example going way, way back to Shakespeare. Let me turn. Oh, that didn't work. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Going back to Shakespeare here, Hamlet says, I will speak daggers to her, but use none. So, can you speak daggers? What he means is, what Shakespeare means is he will say nasty things to her. That is like cutting, like if you stab someone in the heart, right? You hurt, the heart is a symbol of love, right? So being stabbed in the heart is a symbol of betrayal at the highest level because it's somebody that you cared about. So I will speak daggers to her, but use none. So I will hurt her with my words instead of physically hurting her, is what it basically means. So then, another reason why we might use it is to make it to create imagery, to make it come alive in a reader's mind. So here's an example. I was a queen when the glowing sun bowed and kissed my cheek as I lie in the sparkling blades of grass that were like diamonds in my hair. So this brings a lot of imagery, right? Glowing sun bowed and kissed my cheek, so we can feel that, right? We can feel the warmth on the cheek when we've all been outside when the sun was brilliant and we felt the sunshine on our skin. And then the glowing sun, we can see that. Sparkling blades of grass, especially in the morning when there's dew on them, we can see that. That were like diamonds in my hair. So, a person laying there with the sun reflecting on the blades of grass and that are mixed in with the hair, that creates a whole image to use figurative language like that. So, there's different types of figurative language. We've got idioms, which are sort of similar to euphemism, but they're not meant to be used to make something less offensive. Instead, they're just like sayings that people use to communicate something. So that's where I said, like, I'm going to go jump in the shower. That would be an idiom, an example of it. Similes and metaphors are where we compare two things that are not the same, but there's some aspect or element that they are similar in, and that's what we want to show. Usually, one thing is harder to explain. It's either complex or it's abstract. It's a feeling or something. And so we compare it to something material that people would understand really well in order to show something about the first thing being compared. And a simile is where we use comparison language, words such as like, as, resembles, seems. And then metaphor is where we say the one thing is the other thing directly without any comparison language. Hyperbole is an over exaggeration. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. And an understatement is usually something a humble person might do, or you do it to be sarcastic. So a humble person might say when they, did this great thing, they might say, oh, that's what anybody would do. Or, something to kind of minimalize what they did. So it's an understatement instead of an overstatement. So it can also be used to just be satirical too. Like, oh, it's just raining a little bit outside, and when it's really a torrential downpour. Personification and verbal irony. Personification is when we give inanimate objects human-like qualities or characteristics in order to create imagery, usually, but it could also be to point something out. And then verbal irony usually is in the form of sarcasm. So when I say, like, oh, it's just raining a little bit outside, when it's really pouring, I'm basically lying, right? But I'm doing it for some effect. I'm trying to be funny or interesting. Um, Usually funny when you do something like that. And there can be also outright lies, which you'll see in literature and plays where one character is lying to another, and that's verbal irony. And then there's also one called situational irony, or sorry, dramatic irony that you see in plays where one character knows something that another character does not know, but the audience knows. So we're privy, but a character is not, and that's dramatic irony. Situational irony is the regular kind of irony that you're used to, where the opposite of what you expect to happen happens. I always want to click on these, but they don't click. You have to scroll. So here's examples of idioms. Chewing the fat. We were sitting around chewing the fat. Has anyone ever heard that one? It might be more something from more my generation as well. But you heard that a lot when somebody talks about maybe meeting someone or running into someone, and they just say, we were chewing the fat. That means we were just talking. And most of these idioms come out of something real, like that one. The origin of that one is soldiers back in like the 1800s would be camped out somewhere, and they would get these really bad cuts of meat, military food, and they would be really fatty and hard to chew. So they would sit around, a fire and be chewing and chewing on that meat. And while they were chewing, they'd be having conversations. So chewing the fat instead of like trying to eat this horrible steak became having conversations with somebody, just small talking, nothing important, just chatting. So they come to use over many years. Like somebody starts using it, and over the years, more and more people become exposed to it, and then it becomes something that people understand, an idiom that's recognizable. So again, it's figurative language because it doesn't make sense literally. If I say I ran into so and so and we sat around and chewed the fat for a while, there was no fat involved. There was no chewing involved. There was only talking. So you can't look it up. Similes and metaphors. I explained our comparisons. One is using comparative language, and the other is a direct one. So um, here's an example of a simile. The thunder sounded like a bowling ball striking pins. So we've got the word like is the comparison word. We didn't say the thunder was a bowling ball. We just said it was like one. So that's what makes it a simile as opposed to a metaphor, which would be a direct comparison. So the thunder was a bowler's strike, or the divine bowler hit the pins and we all ran for cover in the rain. And what we're talking about is we heard thunder and we ran for cover. So this is the figurative language for thunder. And here is it's comparing the bowler strike to thunder, right? Saying one is the other thing. And the same comparison is made here. The sound of thunder to the sound of a bowling ball striking pins. And what is the point that we're trying to make is that in the same way that most people have heard the bowling ball, I would argue thunder probably is more common to hear, but when you are in a bowling alley, if you've ever been in one and you hear a ball strike the pins, it's quite loud and noisy and striking, not to use that word as a pun, but You definitely take notice of it. And so it's the same with thunder. Hyperbole and understatement. So here's an example of hyperbole, which is also like an overstatement, whereas the understatement's the opposite. Because a hyperbole is where you exaggerate something. So the street light outside my window is brighter than 1,000 suns. Obviously, that's not true. You wouldn't even be able to look at it, right? And you'd be dead because it would burn you alive. But it makes the point that that light is overly bright to me, right? That street light is too bright. And then the understatement minimizes it. So if I don't know how many people have seen Monty Python, where there is the Black Knight fighting and he keeps getting limbs cut off. And he makes this statement, it's just a minor flesh wound. Come on, come back and fight, and it's supposed to be funny. It's actually a satire, but uh, it is also an example of
It's
understatement,
not the
right?
meals.
Say
Just give
again?
me the small cheesesteak combo. I just want you could put everything on it. Just light, very light lettuce.
Let me figure out how to get back in here a second.
Wait, I don't need all that because it's not even going. Just give me the sandwich.
Where's this one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back in here. So anyway, that's an example of an understatement. Personification and verbal irony. I love personification. It's one of my favorite types of figurative language. So, an example here, if my alarm doesn't stop screaming at me, I'm going to throw it out the window. So, here we give the alarm the ability to scream like a human can, right? And so that's what makes it personified. It can be used in pleasant ways too, not just nasty ways like that. Verbal irony, in this case, it's what lovely weather we are having today, right? When it's freezing and raining and cold and nasty. And it's almost like an understatement. It works like an understatement, but it's also, I'm not saying what is truly happening, right? I'm sort of lying in this situation. And that's what makes it verbal irony. Verbal irony is when you state the opposite of the truth. So. Figurative language in poetry is very, very common. I don't think you can have a poem without figurative language and sound effects and other poetic devices. So it's very, very common. In fact, in poetry, it's in verse, not prose. So you don't have enough words to say literally what you're trying to say. And also, it would be a very boring poem if you did try. So you have to use just phrases and clauses, like small bits of language. You don't have to be correct grammatically or have, you can use fragments of sentences and whatnot. And the word choice is highly important because you want to create emotion, right? To convey whatever it is you're trying to convey. So connotations and imagery, sensory details really go a long way in poetry. So you look at those words and how do they create those feelings? How do they create those images? So the meaning again is implied, so you have to draw inferences. Lyric poems express emotion or opinion about one single topic. So a lot of times you'll hear a lyric poem about a certain season of the year, spring, there's a billion of them about spring, but you can find them about winter as well, or love, right? How do I love thee? Let me count the ways, that sort of thing. It's expressing emotion about a single thing. My love is like a red, red rose. And narrative poems tell a story. So they're going to have the same elements of plot that a story would, except for they're told in verse in bits of language. So they'll have characters, they'll have a setting, there's a conflict. Sometimes there's even dialogue in a narrative poem. An example would be The Ancient Mariner, if anybody ever read that, where there's an old sailor on a boat, or sorry, in a place where there's a wedding going on, and he stops this person who's a part of the wedding party, and he makes them stay and listen to a sea story. And that's the beginning of it, and then it goes into the whole story that he tells. Uh, Verse and stanzas instead of paragraphs, right? Prose is sentences, complete sentences, and paragraphs. Poetry is divided instead of into paragraphs, into stanzas, but like a paragraph, they each have one single unit of thought. So when the topic changes, or that thought pattern changes to something a little bit different, we start a new stanza, just same as we in an essay, we would start a new paragraph. So with poetry, because it's not directly stated, everything is implied. Most of the time, sometimes you get some direct statements, but you have to read several times. You have to listen for the sound effects, everything that's going on, repetition, rhyme, rhythm. Sometimes rhythm mirrors action that's going on. Like it might sound like the galloping of a horse or a train, or just a very speedy implying action, or sometimes things end with ing. There's lots of different words. Turning and spinning and wondering gives a sense of movement, right? So there's different effects that can be created by sounds, or repeated sounds. And all of those things you have to take into account when you try to analyze a poem and try to figure out what the author is trying to say by this. You have to listen to everything, what words they choose, what images are generated, and what the sound effects create. Here's an example of just a few lines of poetry. Over the wintry forest, winds howl in rage with no leaves to blow. So this is like a haiku here. We've got um, usually there's a combination of something to do with nature and then something to do with humans. To get the theme, you have to combine the two. And here we have over the wintry forest, winds howl in rage with no leaves to blow because it's winter, right? So maybe and the nice thing about poetry is different people might interpret that differently, and that's okay. To me, I interpret it to mean that sometimes we're angry, right? But our anger isn't going to change anything, right? It's not going to affect anything, and we should approach it differently, right? Here, the wind is howling, but there's nothing to blow because the leaves aren't there. So using details and schemata to draw inferences. So details are from the text, schematas from your brain, all of the information you gathered on a single topic, what you know about how people behave in certain situations, et cetera, et cetera. All of that you know about life in this world and objects in it and people in it, you combine with what the text says. And that's how you draw an inference. So you look at the facts, the voice of the narrator. If it's a poem, it's the speaker of the poem. So what kinds of things is the narrator saying? If it's a story, if it's an essay, what is the tone? What is the style of that writer? How might they feel about what they're talking about? Action and description. So especially in fiction, when you're reading poetry or a story, how is the setting described? A lot of times the setting's going to mirror um, the situation or the conflict. Like maybe it's a place that is foreboding or scary, and that's going to show that something's coming. It might foreshadow something coming, or just demonstrate what the actual conflict is. Maybe it's the snow on a mountain and people are stranded there. Or it could show the feelings of a character. So if it's thundering and lightning, maybe it's mirroring that the character is really angry, or if it's raining, the character is sad, or If it's birds chirping and sun shining, it might show something positive. Or sometimes they do the opposite. Sometimes artists will flip it and they'll show like this beautiful music, like in movies or TV shows, they'll have beautiful music, a beautiful natural scene with the sun rays shining through trees, but somebody's getting murdered and you don't hear it, you just see it, like that sort of thing, which creates a disturbance because we expect when we see one thing to have all of the feelings that are generated from those to go with it. So generally, when you analyze, you're looking for a similar um, effect rather than those kind of strange ones that disturb us that happen. So prior knowledge fills in the gaps, what with text is missing out on or not giving you any information on, fill that in with what you know. And then if to check if your inference is valid, did I make a good inference? Make sure that everything that the text says supports what you've decided is the answer to whatever question you're answering or whatever conclusion you're drawing. It can't go against what the text says, in other words. So facts can support something the author is trying to imply, right? So if they don't say exactly what their position is or why they're using the facts, you have to figure that out. So what are all of these facts adding up to? What are they saying? And look at that. So how are they presenting them? When and where are they presenting them? What else is being discussed at the time? And then what is the effect of using those facts? Do they create an opinion um, or a certain position on something? Are they making you see something? Like maybe it's descriptive, it's facts about how something appears or what something is to a community. So, what might they be saying about the value of whatever that thing is that they are describing and providing facts about? So, the voice of the narrator, it's you have to look at not just what the narrator says, but you have to go sort of beyond that and fill in the gaps when you're making an inference, especially when we're dealing with dialogue, because good dialogue includes something called subtext. So it's often not what is said, but what is not said and what should have been said that's missing in there. Or it's the way it's said. Maybe somebody is trying to engage someone in conversation in the dialogue in a story, and that other person is being very curt, very short. They don't say much. They're just yes, no, sure, and that's sort of the subtext there is, I don't want to talk to you for some reason, right? So it could be because they're really busy and they're getting annoyed, or it could be they're angry with that person. So you have to really kind of go beyond just what the words say and try to take in all of this type of information and think about, what do you know about life? When are people answering in such few words? And think about that and try to draw your conclusion. So again, to test the validity of your inference, you have to make sure all of those clues that you've gathered, what the text actually says there, you have to make sure that they align with whatever inference you've drawn. Oops, going too fast here. I think we're here. So actions sometimes speak louder than words, and the way something's described. And this kind of stuff kind of bleeds over into things that I've already talked about. But what does the character do? Not just what they say, but what do they do in the story? Well, a lot of this it isn't really for nonfiction text like your history textbook or your science textbook, but it's more for the arts where when we're dealing with poetry and stories here. But you also draw inferences in nonfiction, and we talked about most of that at the beginning of this chapter in your book deals with mostly that. But these types of information here on these slides are more for fiction. So, what is the character doing? Are they doing it to be entertaining? What can you learn about the character? How do they respond to other characters who do certain things? How do other characters respond to them? What choices do they make, right? How, again, like a description of a setting or an object that's important to the person can reveal a lot about them. Maybe it's a description of their house or their apartment. And from that description, you can learn a lot about the character as well and draw conclusions, make inferences about what that character is like. Is their bedroom covered with bookshelves? Is there no TV in it? Um, or is there a huge TV and sports regalia on the walls? All of these kinds of things. Is everything very simple or is everything lavishly decorated? All of these kinds of things. What about their clothes? You can learn about what that character is like. And prior knowledge, when you're reading college textbooks, the more you know about the subject, the easier the reading's going to be. The less you know, the harder it's going to be. And that's why I said before that your first classes in any discipline are going to be the hardest, because that's where you have to build um, a box of knowledge about it. And you have to learn all the jargon, all those words that are used in that discipline. So it's harder to draw inferences when you don't have any background knowledge to use related to the topic. So as you move along and you get that background knowledge, it will get easier. You might have to create your own background knowledge. Easy way is to watch a YouTube video about something. They've got those crash course videos on various disciplines that are used for college coursework. They relate really well and they're entertaining as well. They're fun to watch. So I would recommend using one of those. And once you have that enough background knowledge, then you can draw the inference a little more easily. So these are some other ways to expand your prior knowledge, broaden your interests, become interested in things that you weren't previously. When you know you're going to be studying about something, think about something that might be interesting to you in that study and try to look up information and read about it or watch videos about it. Just reading in general will give you more prior knowledge, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it doesn't even matter. Um, I had decided I was going to read War and Peace because I don't know, it just seemed like a challenge. And it, it was kind of like on my bucket list. So I started reading that and I'm learning all about Napoleon and the wars with Russia in that book. So, I mean, I didn't think I'd ever want to be interested in that. But again, just read widely and you're going to learn things that you wouldn't necessarily be interested in. I'm not saying you have to read that book because I don't I don't necessarily recommend it to anyone. It's like a combination of like, I don't know, 10, 12, 16 novels all wrapped up in one. It's crazy. Um, Pay attention to what you encounter in your own life. Like be very observant of things around you, and you'll start to become interested. You'll start to notice things and become interested. Maybe you're going by and somebody's building something, or maybe you see a group of artists, or whatever it is, just things you encounter in life. Just notice and pay attention to them. And then using logic. So beyond just making the inference based on what you know about the world and what the text says, you have to make sure that everything follows like the way a detective would. Does it make sense that this would apply to this situation? So you can say, I know this about life and I know that about life, but you have to make sure that it's both reasonable and valid and that it actually follows from the one thing to the other in a logical way. So conclusions extend inferences. They rely on evidence, what is stated, and assumptions, what is not stated. And different readers may reach different conclusions based on their own personal experience and use of logic. But the most logical conclusions will be, I think, the most reasonable ones. If you make sure that you're looking at it in a logical way and not just making wild guesses or saying, oh, well, this happened once. Well, maybe that's an outlier. Yeah, that might have happened once, but what is more typical of what might be the conclusion of whatever was going on in the text? So it's a little bit different than just making an educated guess. You're going a little bit deeper and a little bit further with it. And so you're making your own conclusions and summing up. It's almost into the evaluative phase of reading where you're kind of making um, how you think it applies to the world, right? So you're kind of making some conclusion that would affect that, would maybe be the starting point for that type of reading. And that's everything that's in this chapter. Does anybody have any questions about that? So we can, actually, I don't have my watch on. 6:35. Let's see what we've got in our textbook here. We are going to work with this chapter also on Thursday. So we'll have the whole period on Thursday to read one of these selections and preview it properly and everything. There's also some other things we could do here. There's words. Let me see. This is just a vocabulary booster using roots and word parts, which we call affixes. And then those are made up of roots and prefixes and suffixes. And the more of these that you kind of learn, the more words you'll know, because all words are made up of word parts. And sometimes they're logical and sometimes they don't work. But if you know the word part, meaning in one word, usually it applies to other words, but not 100% of the time. So on this page 410 of your book, well, let me ask you guys, do you want to do this vocabulary work or do you want to try to read two different, um, if we go to these selections, we have a short story, we have a personal narrative, and what did I skip? There's one on religion here too. So we could probably read two on Thursday. We could start one off too if you don't want to do the vocabulary lesson. What do you guys want to do? I'm gonna um, stop the recording for a moment till we decide.